Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the sources you share with us and turn them into the most fascinating, well-structured conversation you'll have all week. Today, we are focusing on, well, a quiet revolution. We're tracing the life of an individual who didn't just write great books, but, and this is not an exaggeration, fundamentally changed how humanity views its relationship with the natural world.
That's right. We are diving deep into the extraordinary life and work of Rachel Carson. And she was so much more than just a writer. I mean, she's a pioneering marine biologist, a celebrated author for sure, but ultimately a conservationist whose commitment to science and just beautiful prose, it catalyzed the global environmental movement.
The impact is just immense. I mean, when you look at the sources for this, they cover everything from her early scientific training, her acclaimed Sea Trilogy, which was published between 1941 and 1955, all the way up to the seismic shift caused by Silent Spring in 1962.
It really is a study in how rigorous research, when you combine it with courage, can truly transform national policy.
Yeah, and that's really the mission for this deep dive, right? To track her unlikely trajectory.
Exactly. She moved from being this, quiet, dedicated government scientist and a respected nature writer to becoming a figure who challenged the largest, wealthiest industries of the entire post-war era.
She faced down chemical giants.
She did. And as the historical record clearly shows, she directly influenced the creation of crucial governmental institutions, most notably the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA.
The stage for this conflict is just fascinating. Carson's work, it directly challenged the core ideological framework of post-war American culture. This was an era, you have to remember, defined by this unquestioned faith in scientific progress.
Oh, absolutely. Technological quick fixes.
Right.
Chemicals like DDT were promoted as these miracle tools of absolute dominion over nature.
And what Carson did was force the American public to confront the true systemic and long-term costs of these synthetic chemicals. She shifted the focus from, immediate benefit to irreversible consequence.
And crucially, she did this while managing an incredibly intense personal life. It was filled with unexpected tragedy and this relentless financial pressure. Her story is one of profound commitment to meticulous, unassailable scientific research.
Even as she was facing these furious and often, deeply gendered attacks that were designed to discredit her personally and professionally.
Yeah, it's quite a story.
So let's start at the very beginning. Let's try to understand the formation of her interests, her intellect, and her scientific grounding in Section 1, from stream to sea, the making of a scientist.
To understand the power of her voice, you really have to understand the roots of her connection to nature. Rachel Louise Carson was born on May 27, 1907 in Springdale, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Her family lived on this modest 65-acre farm near the Allegheny River. And this wasn't a life of, distant observation. She was completely immersed in exploring the fields and streams surrounding her home from her earliest memories.
So that early immersion led to this dual passion that would really define her career, literature and natural history.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that she was writing stories, almost always about animals in the natural world, by age 8.
8 years old.
8 years old. And she managed to publish her first story in a children's magazine by age 10, which is just, it's a remarkable achievement for a child. It shows this early mastery of communication.
And she was a big reader too, right?
Oh, a voracious reader. And it's telling that her favorite authors, people like Beatrix Potter, who was also a scientist, a fact we often forget.
Right, the mycologist.
Yes. And Herman Melville, they all shared that common thread, this deep focus on the natural world, and particularly the mysteries of the ocean. This early fusion of a poetic sensibility with a really inquisitive scientific mind just set her apart. She wasn't just describing nature, she was interpreting it.
So when she first went to college, Pennsylvania College for Women, which is now Chatham University, she actually started as an English major.
She did. But by 1928, she made what the sources confirm was a truly pivotal shift. She changed her major to biology, and she later graduated magna cum laude, which demonstrates that her scientific aptitude was every bit as profound as her literary one.
And that success led her to graduate work at Johns Hopkins University.
Right, where she pursued her master's degree in zoology. And her thesis, it focused on a highly specific and technical topic, the embryonic development of the pronephros.
Okay, you're going to have to explain what that is.
It's essentially the primordial temporary urinary organ in fish, a very, very specific piece of biology. She earned that MS in 1932.
Now, why dwell on the pronephros? I mean, it sounds like something out of a textbook, but it's actually a crucial piece of the puzzle here.
It is.
This highly focused work on a small, vital organ within a systemic context fish biology. It demonstrates her early training in understanding how complex biological systems function at a cellular level.
Exactly. This perspective on the interconnectedness of biological life would become the absolute bedrock of her critique of pesticides later on. She was trained to see the whole system, not just the isolated parts.
Precisely. She had planned to continue on for her doctorate, but this promising academic path was just brutally interrupted by the immediate crushing financial pressures of the Great Depression.
The sources paint a really clear picture of sacrifice. In 1934, she was forced to leave Johns Hopkins because she desperately needed full-time income to support her family.
And the situation only got worse from there.
Much worse. Her father died in 1935, and then suddenly, in January of 1937, her older sister passed away.
Wow.
And just like that, Carson, still so early in her career, she becomes the sole economic support for 3 dependents, her aging mother and her 2 nieces. This intense, persistent financial pressure, it really defined the early decades of her professional life.
It forced her into the professional world quickly and, required a lot of ingenuity just to keep her family afloat.
It did. And her first professional job was a temporary position with the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. And this is where the literary side truly became practical. Her task was to write engaging radio copy for a weekly educational series called Romance Under the Waters.
And this was not an easy assignment from what the sources say.
No, not at all. The job required producing 52 7-minute programs, a huge undertaking designed to make aquatic life accessible and interesting to the average American listener.
And other writers had tried and failed, right?
Several had failed to capture the public imagination. But Carson succeeded. She just had this gift for weaving scientific fact into compelling narrative arcs.
And her supervisor noticed.
He did. He recognized her unique talent. He deemed an essay she wrote, which was initially intended for a public brochure. It was titled The World of Waters. He said it was too good for a simple handout. He encouraged her to revise it into a full article. It was published as Undersea in the Atlantic Monthly in July of 1937, and that one essay secured her a book deal.
But even before that publishing success, her work at the Bureau led to a massive professional breakthrough.
A huge one.
Yeah.
Because of her effectiveness, her supervisor fought to get her a full-time, permanent position. She had to take the civil service exam, and she outscored all applicants, men and women.
Incredible.
And so in 1936, she became only the second woman hired by the Bureau of Fisheries for a full-time professional role as a junior aquatic biologist.
It's just this quiet testament to her competence. I mean, you think about it. She was balancing the pressures of being the sole breadwinner, navigating a very male-dominated government bureaucracy, and simultaneously launching a literary career.
All stemming from that initial desperate need to support her family.
And the publication of Undersea was that moment her 2 worlds really fused. Rigorous government science and, poetic literature. And that leads us directly into Section 2, the path to literary stardom, the Sea Trilogy, which cemented her reputation years before the controversies of Silent Spring even began.
Right. Her first book, Under the Sea Wind, was published in 1941. It received really strong critical acclaim, especially for its lyricism and its accuracy.
But the timing was terrible.
Awful. It was released just as America was plunging into World War II, so the initial sales were pretty disappointing. She had to continue supplementing her income by writing articles for major publications like the Baltimore Sun and Collier's just to keep the family budget balanced.
And despite her growing literary profile, she was still stuck in this government job that she found increasingly frustrating.
Very frustrating. By 1945, she was actively trying to leave the newly renamed Fish and Wildlife Service. But this was immediately post-Manhattan Project, and the sources highlight a really significant shift in federal funding.
Right, the money was all going to a certain kind of science.
Absolutely. The funding bias of the era heavily favored the hard, technical, and applied sciences. The kind of science that had just won the war. Physics, chemistry, engineering.
And naturalists like Carson, who focused on ecology and biological systems, they were often just overlooked for advancement and for the better funded positions.
So she stayed. But she kept rising through the ranks. By 1949, she was appointed chief editor of publications. Now, this brought more field work and better pay, but also what she described as just soul-crushing administrative and bureaucratic duties. She really needed a way out.
And her escape route came through a really key professional relationship. In 1948, she hired a literary agent, Marie Rodell.
Yes, and they formed this very close partnership that was just instrumental in guiding her next great work.
A partnership that led directly to her massive breakthrough, The Sea Around Us, in 1951.
And this book was just a monumental undertaking. It wasn't just a nature book. It was a grand scientific history of the ocean. It explored everything from the creation of the sea itself, the forces of the tides, and the life found in the shores, right down to the abyssal depths.
And the timing on this one was perfect.
Perfect. Chapters were serialized in The New Yorker, which generated this immense anticipation. When the book officially launched, it was an overnight phenomenon. It resonated so powerfully with a post-war public that was newly aware of global scale and scientific possibility.
The success was staggering. I mean, it stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for an incredible 86 weeks.
That's almost 2 full years. It won the 1952 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and it instantly brought her this widespread recognition, not just as a capable scientist, but as one of the most gifted prose stylists of her entire generation.
So what did that mean for her, practically?
Financial security. Finally, the sources really emphasized that the income from this book finally allowed her to quit her government job in 1952. She could realize her lifelong dream of just concentrating solely on her writing.
And the book was so successful, it also triggered the republication of Under the Sea Wind, right?
It did, which then also became a bestseller, just confirming her status as America's preeminent nature writer.
But that success, it came with a powerful and kind of cautionary lesson, what our sources call the documentary conflict.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story. Because the book was so popular, she licensed a documentary film, also titled The Sea, which subsequently won an Academy Award in 1953. You would think this validation of her work would be a huge triumph for her.
But it turned into a massive professional setback for her and a moment of great disillusionment. Carson had review rights for the script, but she found the final product, which was produced by Irwin Allen, to be scientifically inaccurate and, well, profoundly cheesy.
She felt it just betrayed the atmosphere and the integrity of her book. She famously called it a cross between a Believe It or Not and a breezy travelogue.
Ouch.
The real problem was that her review rights did not give her control over the final content. She realized that in the shift from print to film, her careful scientific messaging had been warped and sensationalized for popular appeal.
And this experience was so embittering that the sources confirm she never again sold film rights to her work. That's a fascinating detail about her character. It shows that even when she was facing immense celebrity and financial incentive, maintaining the unblemished integrity of the scientific message was just non-negotiable for her.
It was everything. And it's a principle she would need to rely on profoundly when she started writing Silent Spring.
And she applied that same principle when completing the Sea trilogy with The Edge of the Sea in 1955.
Right. This book was more focused than its predecessor. It concentrated specifically on the coastal ecosystems of the Atlantic shore, detailing life in tide pools and estuaries. And it just solidified her reputation for, and this is a quote, clear and poetical prose.
And the sources note that this completion marked a definitive transition for her. She was already pivoting her interests toward conservation. There's evidence of a book she tentatively planned next, titled Remembrance of the Earth. And she also began getting more involved with conservation groups, notably the Nature Conservancy. She was clearly moving from just describing nature to actively defending it.
But that defense, it required all her personal fortitude as she was about to enter the most stressful period of her life. And that leads us to Section 3, the call to arms, researching Silent Spring. This part of the story reveals the deeply personal toll and the motivation behind her monumental achievement.
The sources reveal this heartbreaking family crisis that occurred just as her professional focus was shifting. In early 1957, her niece, whom she had cared for years, died at the age of 31.
So tragic. And this left Carson to officially adopt her 5-year-old grandnephew, Roger Christie. So now she's balancing the demands of raising a young child, caring for her aging mother, and undertaking this increasingly complex research.
All from her home in Silver Spring, Maryland, she was the absolute anchor of this really vulnerable household.
And this relentless pressure really highlights the necessity of her emotional support system, which came in the form of her extraordinary 12-year friendship with a woman named Dorothy Freeman.
Right. And the sources emphasize that this relationship was primarily conducted through correspondence. They wrote nearly 900 letters to each other.
The published letters, which are collected in a book called Always Rachel, they offer this incredibly intimate window into her life. Her biographer noted that Carson desperately needed a, quote, devoted friend and kindred spirit who would listen to her without advising and accept her wholly, the writer as well as the woman.
And Dorothy Freeman filled that crucial role, offering essential emotional respite from the constant professional and personal stress.
The depth of their bond is just undeniable. It provided the emotional scaffolding that allowed Carson to pursue her dangerous and controversial next project. Her final words to Freeman, which she later recounted, were a clear declaration. "Never forget, dear one, how deeply I have loved you all these years."
Wow.
The creation of Silent Spring was, in a way, subsidized by this intense, private, emotional commitment.
And while she was managing this profound personal stress, the professional catalyst for her new book emerged. The dramatic and, frankly, irresponsible overuse of pesticides across the country.
Yeah, in the late 1950s, she became deeply troubled by federal proposals for widespread, often indiscriminate, aerial spraying.
The specific triggers were numerous, but two really stand out in the sources.
Right. The USDA had this aggressive plan to eradicate fire ants across the South, using massive quantities of highly toxic chlorinated hydrocarbons and organophosphates.
And Carson had actually first encountered the celebrated chemical DDT, which was lauded as the insect bomb way back in 1945. But the subject just lacked traction with editors then.
It wasn't until the highly publicized 1957 gypsy moth eradication program that things really changed for her. That program involved aerial spraying of DDT mixed with fuel oil directly over private lands and farms.
That was the moment she decided this had to be her next and perhaps most important book. The lack of accountability and the broad-spectrum destruction of life just shocked her.
And here's where civilian action comes in and really motivates her research. That gypsy moth program sparked immediate resistance. A group of Long Island landowners filed a major lawsuit to stop the spraying.
Now, they ultimately lost the case, but the legal discussions that followed established a critical precedent. The Supreme Court granted petitioners the right to gain injunctions against potential environmental damage in the future.
And that legal fight was the moment conservation groups realized they needed a powerful scientific voice to publicize the risks. Groups like the Audubon Naturalist Society actively recruited Carson, asking her to lend her pen and her scientific authority to the cause.
And she agreed, initiating this meticulous 4-year research process that lasted from 1958 to 1962.
Her method was exhaustive. She gathered thousands of documented cases of environmental damage attributed to chemicals like DDT. She drew on formal scientific literature, but also, and this is critical, on confidential information supplied by sympathetic government scientists.
People who are wary of speaking out publicly for fear of losing their jobs.
Exactly. And she quickly identified the fundamental scientific division regarding pesticides. Our sources indicate there were two primary scientific camps. The first camp demanded absolutely conclusive proof of danger, which is often an impossible standard in toxicology, before any restriction could be put in place.
Right. The show me the bodies argument.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the second camp, which Carson joined, argued that the mere possibility of systemic harm necessitated caution and required immediate exploration of alternatives, particularly biological pest control.
And this is where we uncover a detail that's often missed in her story: the critical, uncredited sources she relied upon.
Yes. To buttress her professional scientific research, she heavily utilized evidence and legal trial transcripts from 1957 to 1960. This material was compiled by grassroots activists, specifically biodynamic agriculture market gardeners like Marjorie Spock and Mary T. Richards of Long Island, who had directly contested the aerial spraying.
So these were women who were advocates for ecologically conscious farming, what we might call organic or natural methods today.
Right. And they had amassed what Carson called a gold mine of information. They tracked bird deaths, sickness in their livestock, damage to their crops, all following the spraying.
And she intentionally left them uncredited in the book. Why was that?
It was likely a strategic choice. She needed her argument to be viewed purely through the lens of objective government science and professional research. She had to protect it from being dismissed as, amateur or fringe activism.
As her research intensified, the conflict became more and more public. In 1959, the USDA released this public service film actively defending the use of chemicals like dieldrin and heptachlor.
And Carson immediately characterized it as, quote, flagrant propaganda. That spring, she published a highly influential letter in the Washington Post that directly attributed the silencing of birds to pesticide overuse. She was introducing the very metaphor that would define her masterpiece.
She also attended FDA hearings on what became known as the Great Cranberry Scandal, where commercial cranberry crops were tainted with aminotriazole, a known carcinogen.
And she was just deeply discouraged by what she saw, not just by the contamination, but by the chemical industry's aggressive tactics at the hearings. She watched expert testimony from industry scientists that directly contradicted the established scientific literature she was compiling.
And that's when she started to speak out about the, quote, financial inducements behind certain pesticide programs.
Exactly. And this incredible period of professional confrontation was happening while she faced a devastating private health battle.
Yeah, this is the part of the story that's just astonishing. By 1960, after suffering chronic infections and ulcers, she discovered malignant cysts in her left breast, which required a mastectomy. By December of that year, she knew the cancer had metastasized.
It's genuinely astonishing to consider the personal cost. She purposely concealed her illness from the public and from her critics. The sources confirmed she feared, and as it turned out, correctly, that if the chemical companies learned she had terminal cancer, they would use it to dismiss her work.
Claiming her book was untrustworthy and biased because she was sick or emotionally unstable.
Right. The strength required to maintain that facade of robust health while writing a book that challenged the most powerful corporations in the world. It's almost unimaginable. She continued her rigorous research despite the pain, knowing that the book just had to be completed.
And despite all those struggles, the final touches came together. In August of 1961, her agent, Marie Rodell, suggested the now iconic metaphorical title, Silent Spring.
And Carson immediately embraced it. She recognized that it captured the bleak future she feared for the entire natural world, not just a specific list of chemicals.
And significantly, the very last section she wrote was that gentle introductory chapter, A Fable for Tomorrow.
Yes, which was designed to ease the reader into the frightening scientific facts that followed. She used this powerful, evocative prose to show a future where all natural beauty had vanished. It was a literary strategy to ensure the reader emotionally understood the stakes before confronting the complex data.
She knew she was releasing a bombshell. Now we move into Section 4. The bombshell content and immediate reception of Silent Spring. This book wasn't just a regulatory critique. It was an ideological declaration of war against the post-war American way of life.
It was. It was a direct, explicit challenge to the paradigm of scientific progress that defined post-war American culture. This idea that technology could and should conquer all natural problems without systemic consequence.
And Carson's core argument was deceptively simple. She insisted that pesticides, a term that implies selective killing, were more accurately termed biocides.
And the reason for this linguistic distinction is absolutely vital. As she meticulously detailed, the effects of these chemicals were rarely limited to the target pests. They were broad-spectrum poisons that entered the food web,
Often leading to what she called bioaccumulation.
Bioaccumulation is the key concept. Using examples she detailed, DDT is fat-soluble, so it enters the water and it's absorbed by tiny plankton. Then small fish eat large amounts of that plankton, accumulating the DDT in their own fatty tissues.
And then it just moves up the food chain.
Right. Larger fish eat the smaller fish, concentrating the chemical further. By the time a bird of prey, like an eagle, eats those large contaminated fish, the DDT concentration is exponentially higher than the original level in the water.
Which leads to thin eggshells, reproductive failure, and the ultimate silencing of birds. She showed that the food web itself was the vehicle of the poison.
Exactly. And she detailed other systemic consequences. She predicted that this chemical treadmill would lead to increased insect resistance, which would require ever more toxic chemicals. She warned that weakened ecosystems would become vulnerable to unanticipated invasive species.
And she brought the danger home to the listener, detailing documented cases of human pesticide poisoning and, critically, cancer.
She relied heavily on evidence from researchers like Dr. Wilhelm Hooper of the National Cancer Institute, who had already classified many common pesticides as carcinogens. She specifically cited evidence that DDT produced suspicious liver tumors in lab animals, making the threat immediate and personal.
It was no longer some distant environmental problem. It was a public health crisis.
And here's the crucial nuance that our listener really needs to grasp, because it is so often misremembered. Carson never, at any point, advocated for an outright, immediate, total ban on DDT or all pesticides.
That distinction is paramount. Her argument was not anti-science or anti-technology. It was a demand for ecological intelligence and for restraint.
Right. She showed that the overuse of these chemicals was inherently self-defeating because it accelerated the evolution of pest resistance. She even noted that international malaria programs are threatened by resistance among mosquitoes because decades of indiscriminate spraying.
So she offered clear, measured advice. She cited experts like the director of Holland's Plant Protection Service who said, spray as little as you possibly can to make the pressure on the test population as slight as possible.
She was seeking an integrated approach. Biological controls first, and chemicals only as a last resort, used sparingly and intelligently.
But the chemical industry, which had billions of dollars invested in the status quo, had absolutely no interest in nuance. The moment the book's serialization began in The New Yorker, in June 1962, the backlash was fierce, immediate, and highly coordinated.
Chemical giants, particularly DuPont and Velsicol, immediately mobilized their public relations machines. They aggressively compiled reports on the book's projected impact and planned these massive counterattacks.
And Velsicol, which was a primary manufacturer of the highly toxic compounds chlordane and heptachlor, they went a step further. They actually threatened legal action against Houghton Mifflin, the book's publishers, and the magazines that were serializing the book.
This wasn't merely a professional debate in the pages of a scientific journal. This was an attempt to silence the critique entirely through legal and economic intimidation.
And when they couldn't shut her down professionally, they turned to personal, just vicious character attacks.
The attacks were brutal. Critics attacked her credentials, claiming a marine biologist had no business commenting on biochemistry. They labeled her a fanatic defender of the cult of the balance of nature.
And unforgivably, the attacks quickly became highly gendered, aiming to undermine her credibility based entirely on her sex.
She was frequently and often violently labeled a woman out of control, hysterical, and emotional. These attacks were designed to suggest that her views were driven by sentiment rather than by rigorous science, reinforcing the prevalent view that serious, objective science was the domain of men.
One of the most shocking slurs came from the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson. He reportedly concluded she was probably a communist.
And his reasoning was just.
It was based in part on the ridiculous and sexist idea that she was unmarried yet physically attractive. It's just absurd. These political and gendered slurs were designed to associate her and her ideas with dangerous, radical fringe movements.
And throughout all of this, the critics repeatedly and intentionally misrepresented her core message. They falsely asserted she was demanding the elimination of all pesticides, completely ignoring her detailed arguments for measured use, for regulation, and for biological alternatives.
But the very ferocity of this coordinated industrial attack, it started to backfire.
It did. The public recognized the disproportionate nature of the response. And furthermore, the book itself achieved massive distribution. It was selected as the Book of the Month for October 1962.
Which ensured it reached an estimated 500,000 readers, including, as one source noted, farms and hamlets all over that country that don't know what a bookstore looks like.
And then came the moment of ultimate public vindication through television. The CBS Reports TV special, The Silent Spring of Rachel Carson, aired in April 1963 and reached an audience of between 10 and 15 million viewers. This shifted the entire public narrative.
That television special was so instrumental. Carson appeared calm, informed, and articulate. She was just speaking from a position of scientific rigor.
Right. And her critics, like the biochemist Robert White Stevens, were often portrayed in their white lab coats, but were described in our sources as being wild-eyed and loud-voiced. The contrast was deliberate, and it was devastating to the industry's position. The public reaction was overwhelmingly positive toward Carson.
And her official scientific and political vindication quickly followed. She testified before President John F. Kennedy's Science Advisory Committee.
And their report, which was issued on May 15, 1963, only months after the TV special, it largely backed her scientific claims and spurred immediate congressional review of pesticide regulation. Within a year of publication, the intensely hysterical attacks had, for the most part, lost their momentum.
It's just a powerful testament to the idea that rigor eventually defeats rhetoric. She fought that war while simultaneously fighting a terminal disease, which makes her public appearances, her testimony, and her composure during that television special just an incredible act of courage.
Her work had already set irreversible systemic changes into motion. And that brings us to Section 5, the enduring legacy. She did more than write a book. She built a movement that irrevocably reshaped the regulatory infrastructure of the United States and the world.
Her writing served as the central scientific blueprint for the grassroots movement that followed. The arguments and data she synthesized in Silent Spring became the foundation for the Environmental Defense Fund, which was formed in 1967.
And this new organization leveraged her scientific authority to file legal actions against the government and against industry. They systematically worked through the legal system, arguing that the documented harms outweighed the claimed benefits.
Ultimately securing a phase-out of DDT use in the U.S. by 1972. This was a direct, traceable impact of her research.
But perhaps the most profound and institutional legacy is the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA.
Right. The Nixon administration established the EPA in 1970, and this was a direct response to one of Carson's most critical concerns, the inherent conflict of interest within the existing regulatory structure.
This detail is so crucial for understanding the institutional necessity here. Under the old system, the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, was responsible for promoting agriculture and maximizing crop yields. But it was also responsible for regulating the very pesticides that industry used.
And Carson argued that this combination was just a moral and an institutional failure.
It had to be. The agency tasked with promoting economic growth in farming could never impartially regulate the toxic tools used to achieve that growth.
So the EPA was created to separate those roles. It removed the regulatory function from the USDA and placed it within an independent agency whose entire mission was environmental and public health protection, not agricultural promotion.
Years later, one journalist famously described the EPA as, quote, the extended shadow of Silent Spring. Much of the agency's early work, including the enforcement of new laws like the 1972 Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA,
which requires safety testing and labeling for pesticides,
was a direct consequence of the public and political scrutiny Carson generated.
Sadly, Carson did not live to see the full implementation of this systemic change. She was weakened by breast cancer and the exhausting radiation treatments. She contracted a respiratory virus, and the cancer had spread to her liver. She died of a heart attack on April 14, 1964. She was only 56.
Her final wishes were carried out by her closest confidants, her agent, her editor, and Dorothy Freeman. Her ashes were scattered in Maine's Sheepscot Bay, a coastal area she loved and where she often found solace.
Her literary influence, however, it continued long after her death. The Sense of Wonder, an essay she had hoped to expand, was published posthumously in 1965.
Which is such a beautiful work. It was a gentle, passionate exhortation to parents to share the lasting pleasures of contact with the natural world with their children, a powerful counterpoint to the darkness of Silent Spring.
And this was later followed by collections of her works like Lost Woods in 1998, ensuring her continued presence in the environmental literary landscape.
And her official honors are just extensive. They testify to her national importance. She was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, in 1980. She was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 1973.
And her name lives on in countless memorials. Research vessels, parks, schools, the Rachel Carson Bridge in Pittsburgh, and the massive Rachel Carson National Wildlife Refuge. But perhaps her most dynamic legacy lies in the intellectual currents she influenced.
Specifically, the ecofeminist movement recognizes the profound significance of her story. The sources highlight that the gendered nature of the attacks against her, labeling her emotional, hysterical, and an amateur, inadvertently cemented her iconic legacy.
Ecofeminist scholars argue that her challenge to the massive corporate capitalism of agribusiness and the military-industrial complex was inextricably intertwined with the criticism of her female credentials.
Right. It turned her resistance into an enduring symbol for those advocating for environmental protection outside of the traditional, often male-dominated centers of corporate and governmental power.
She transformed a niche topic, chemical residues, into a foundational moral and political question for the entire planet. Her achievement was not just writing a scientific book, but transforming public perception of the relationship between humans and nature.
She used courage, accessibility, and just rigorous research to force government accountability and usher in the era of modern environmental protection.
So what does this all mean for us today? Carson fundamentally shifted the conversation away from this idea of unquestioned dominion over nature to one of cautious stewardship.
A stewardship where the long-term systemic consequences must always outweigh short-term economic gain.
Her work remains the ultimate blueprint for how a single individual, armed with meticulously documented evidence, can challenge overwhelming corporate and governmental power and win.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. Carson fought so hard to eliminate the dangerous conflict of interest when the government agency promoting agriculture the USDA, was also responsible for regulating the very pesticides used by that industry.
And while the EPA solved that conflict institutionally in 1970, we noted that historically, policies later emphasized economic growth over environmental protection, often leading to rollbacks.
So the question then becomes, to what extent have we truly solved the core institutional conflicts of interest Carson identified back in 1962?
Are we sure that agencies tasked with ensuring economic prosperity or specific industry growth aren't still compromising environmental regulation?
And how does that ongoing institutional tension influence the climate and environmental challenges we face today?
It's a challenge she laid bare 60 years ago that is arguably more relevant now than ever. Thank you for joining us as we unpack the extraordinary life and world-changing legacy of Rachel Carson.